Let's continue, and now that we have a component which shows remaining time for a particular activity, this time is not automatically updated whenever we select new time by using this select box. And also whenever we're gonna track the time for this activity on the timeline page, we're supposed to sum up all these tracked times and then subtract this total time from the remaining time, just to calculate how much time we still need to spend to fully complete particular activity. And just to make our testing easier, we're going to change a little bit the logic, which generates timeline item objects. And for now, we're going to generate random activities only for the first 5 objects from this array. So let's start. Inside of the functions.js, let's find that function which generates timeline item objects. It is this generate timeline items function. And here we're going to comment out these 2 lines and actually change the logic which derive random values for activity ID and activity seconds properties. And in order to generate random activities only for the first 5 timeline item objects, let's write the following expression here. I'm going to create an array with 5 elements, and then let's check if the value stored within parameter hour is included within this array. We're going to select a random activity from the activities array. For example, let's get a remainder of the division of the parameter hour by 3. And then extract an identifier of this activity. And in all other cases, we're not going to assign any activity, so let's use null. And for the activity seconds property, the condition will be pretty much the same. Here we're also going to check if our parameter is included within this array. And if so, let's just multiply this hour parameter by 600 to get more or less appropriate value which characterizes amount of seconds. And if activity for this particular hour was not chosen, we're gonna use 0 seconds. And that's it. Now if we take a look at the timeline page, we're gonna see that actually only first 5 timeline items from this list have random activities assigned, as well as random time. And now having all this test data in place, let's go back to activity seconds to complete component and figure out how we're going to calculate amount of remaining seconds for a particular activity. So first of all, I'm going to create new constant, seconds, and the way we're going to calculate amount of seconds will be as follows. Firstly, let's call the function getTotalActivitySeconds, which does not exist yet. So this function is supposed to return sum of the tracked seconds for the particular activity. And then by subtracting values stored within seconds to complete property of the activity object, we can get remaining time we still have to spend to fully finish this activity. And since we're using props object in here, we need to assign all the props to props constant, like this. So in order to calculate the sum of the tracked seconds for a particular activity, this function getTotalActivitySeconds needs to know which activity exactly it should calculate amount of seconds for, as well as it needs to know where to get those seconds we need to sum up. And all those seconds are stored within the objects inside of timeline items array. So we're going to pass 2 parameters to this function. First one will be an activity object, and the second one will be timeline items array. And of course, none of this data is available in this component yet, so we need to accept it from outside. So let's copy the declaration of timeline items prop and paste it within our activity seconds to complete component. And at the top, let's import missing validation function, validate timeline items. And then once the difference of seconds will be calculated and stored within seconds constant, before actually storing amount of seconds, we have to apply formatting, which we can do by using formatSeconds function. So let's wrap this expression into function called formatSeconds. And now we need to find a way how to pass timeline items array within this object, since this is not available yet here. So let's go to the parent component activity item and pass timeline items array as a prop with a name timeline items, like this. But the problem is that this timeline items array is not even available in this parent component. So we need to pass timeline items array from the ancestor component. Once again, let's copy over declaration of timeline items prop from the timeline component and paste it into activity item component. So we're gonna have to pass timeline item prop from outside. And again, in this file, let's scroll up and import validation function, validate timeline items. And now let's go up in the tree of components, open up parent component, which in this case is the activities component, And to every activity item component, we're going to pass timeline items array as another prop. So let's add this prop in here. And by the way, even in this component, this timeline items array is not available. So we need to use the same technique and add declaration of timeline items prop within this component, as well as add import for validate timeline items function. And finally, the parent component for this, the activities component, is actually our root component, where we actually see this timeline items array is defined. So right now, all we need to do is to pass this array to the activities component. Let's copy this prop from the timeline component and paste it in here. And of course, this is not the best way of passing properties through many different components that don't even use this component, but still have to accept this property to pass it further down the chain to the component, which actually needs this property. In the upcoming lessons, we're gonna see a better approach to do this, but for now, let's continue. And now, since we have passed timeline items array from the parent component to the activities component, eventually this array is going to end up within our activity seconds to complete component within timeline items prop that we're passing as a second parameter in here to get total activity seconds function to calculate sum of the tracked seconds for a particular activity. So next, what we're gonna do is to actually define this function get total activity seconds. Let's switch over to functions.js and write about generate timeline items function. We're going to create new function with the name get total activity seconds, which is going to accept two parameters, activity object and timeline items array. And for now, let's just return 0 in here. And eventually our difference of seconds will be calculated, and this way we're gonna find out how much time we still need to spend on a particular activity to fully complete it. So actually, before writing implementation of our get total activity seconds function, let's import it at the top from the functions module. And let's talk about how it is supposed to work. So for example, I would like to spend on the activity coding 30 minutes. I choose this option in here. We see that the remaining time of 30 minutes appears to the right. That's our goal that we have set for this activity. And now let's go to the timeline page and see where this activity is chosen for which timeline items. As we can see, this activity is chosen for the first hour, but in this case, tracked time is 0. So that means that we haven't spent any time within this hour for that particular activity coding. And if we scroll down a little bit, we will see that there is one more timeline item where that activity is chosen. And this time we have tracked 30 minutes for the coding activity. So that means that we have achieved our goal for this coding activity. And if we subtract this amount of time that we have specified for the coding activity from the time that we have already tracked for this activity, we're supposed to get a difference which is 0. So the 0 should be displayed right here. And as we can see right now, it doesn't work as expected. So let's start implementing get total activity seconds function. And just to calculate amount of tracked time for a particular activity, first of all, we're gonna go over timeline item objects and filter this array by specific activity that we try to calculate amount of seconds for. So we're gonna write a simple condition and check if current timeline item was assigned the activity we're looking for. And this activity is passed as a first parameter into this function. So we're basically comparing IDs of these activities. And this way, at the end, it's going to produce new array, which consists only of those timeline items that were assigned activity that we need. And then on this new array, we're going to use another native method called reduce. This method accepts closure, which in turn receives two parameters. First parameter is going to contain final value we're going to calculate. In our case, it will be total amount of seconds tracked for the particular activity. And the second parameter will be timeline item object. And since this closure will be called for every timeline item object, from the filtered array we're going to receive every timeline item object within this parameter. And as a second argument, reduce accepts initial value, which will be assigned to the first parameter total seconds. And we start our calculation from 0 seconds, so let's specify 0 as a second parameter. And here to calculate total amount of seconds for a particular activity, we're gonna have to add value stored within activity seconds property of every timeline item object to the total amount of seconds calculated by now, which is stored within total seconds parameter. And the value which will be returned from this closure is going to be assigned to total seconds parameter in the following call of this closure for the next timeline item object. And at the same time here, we also round the resulting value. So let's take a look at our timeline page and see how much time was initially tracked for the coding activity. As we can see, coding activity is assigned to the first timeline item, but in this case, the value of tracked seconds is 0. And as for the fourth timeline item, we can see that tracked time in this case is 30 minutes. And this value of time is of course taken from activity seconds property of the particular timeline item object. But originally, this time is represented by seconds. And eventually, after running all these instructions, at the end, we're gonna get total amount of seconds tracked for a particular activity, because we went through all the timeline items and summed up values of activity seconds properties of every timeline item object, but only those timeline item objects that were assigned a particular activity that we are trying to calculate amount of seconds for. And then from this total tracked time, we're going to subtract our initial goal that we have set for this activity. And that initial time is stored within seconds to complete property of activity object. And at the end, this calculated difference will be displayed in this component. So initially we have tracked 30 minutes for the coding activity, and our goal is also 30 minutes. So we see that the difference of seconds in this case will be 0, which is displayed in our activity seconds to complete component, because we have subtracted the time that we have chosen for this activity, which is 30 minutes, from the time that we have tracked, which is also 30 minutes. So in this case, we consider this activity as finished, because we have achieved our goal. But for now, this functionality has a lot of flaws yet, because if we decide to change our goal by selecting different value, our component which shows remaining time is not going to be updated. And even if we will start tracking time for the coding activity, in this case also, that activity seconds to complete component will show initial time. But in this case, since our stopwatch is currently running, this time displayed in here should decrease every second. So we are going to work on this functionality in the upcoming lessons.